Warning, the following video completely spoils the plot of the beginner's guide. If you don't know what the beginner's guide is, the description on the game's Steam page, which I've linked below, does a pretty good job. I absolutely love the beginner's guide and would even go so far as to say it's one of my favorite games released this year, but I don't think it's for everyone. I do think you should check this game out if any of the 4 elements of this list apply to you. I recommend you play this game if you see yourself as creative, and I'm going to circle this one because I think it's the most important factor on this list. If you've ever felt severely misunderstood, if you've struggled with social anxiety and/or depression, and if you have a tendency to analyze the fiction you consume in order to find higher meanings and symbolism. And sure enough, all of these apply to me, and that's why I think this game resonated with me as well as it did. I can't say it was my favorite game that I played this year, but it definitely was the one that left me with the largest emotional impact so far. After giving my thoughts on Twitter, someone replied to me with this tweet, and I think he summarized my reaction to this game quite well. The rest of the video is going to assume that you have experienced the beginner's guide. It's also going to be less of an analysis or review, and more of a personal reflection inspired by this game's subject matter. Spoilers are fair game from this point on.
But it's ironic, isn't it, that in playing this game and seeing how alone Coda often felt, that we get to know him better and actually kind of connect with him. And I have to be honest with you, this idea is really seductive to me. That I could just play someone's game and see the voices in their head and get to know them better and have to do less of the messy in-person socializing. I could just get to know you through your work. I think this is why I always liked Coda's games so much, is because it felt like they let me have that connection. I felt as though he was inviting me personally into his world. And then I feel less lonely too.
The beginner's guide centers on only 2 characters. Our narrator, Davey, is a constant presence throughout the game, and by the time we see the credits we have a pretty solid idea of who he is and why he does what he does as a result of his first-hand statements to the player. Our second character, Coda, is a bit harder to understand. For the majority of the game, we don't directly hear anything from him. All we have to go off of are his games, his works of self-expression. It isn't until the end, when the player finds the messages for Davey in the tower, that we even come close to hearing from Coda, and while those messages are the most straightforward things we get out of him, they still exist within the realm of his creation. For all intents and purposes, we can never truly say we get to know Coda. We only have Davey's stories of their interactions, Davey's interpretations of his games, and our own interpretations of his games to go off of. In part 1, we're going to mostly ignore Davey and his perspective on the games. Don't worry, we'll talk about them in part 2. For now, let's focus on Coda. It's obvious from the start that Coda is a creative person. Even his most generic game, a sci-fi FPS with a highly derivative setup and cheesy protagonist sacrifice at the end, has a charming personal touch thrown in the form of the random maze segment. We go through a room full of his game ideas, all of which are bizarre concepts that are odd even by indie standards. Hell, the fact that he made a game to store all of his ideas in rather than just making a TXT file somewhere probably says a lot in and of itself. Many people would probably say that Coda is creative to a fault, that his unwillingness to compromise with the player's desire for accessible or enjoyable design decisions is a major flaw. And while that might be true, it's important to remember that Coda intended to create these games mostly for himself. He doesn't seem particularly interested in having too many people play these games other than the occasional close friend or a stranger at a gaming event. Before moving on, let's take a minute to create a basic diagram of creating fiction. This is something I don't really want to get too detailed with because people far smarter than I still debate what this looks like exactly, so let's just go with something simple. Let's call the first step in this diagram creator makes thing. This is obviously a lot more complicated than we're making it sound, and in many cases a thing is made by a team of people rather than an individual, but for now this is fine. The second step is audience experience this thing. People find the creation and consume it, simple enough. The third and final step is audience provides feedback. The people who experienced the creation will give an opinion on it, whether in public or in private, and more often than not a general consensus on what the piece did successfully and unsuccessfully will form over time. Generally, if the creator goes on to another project, the feedback they're exposed to will have an effect on their new creation. Even if they don't agree with the feedback or they try their best to ignore the feedback, it will always have an influence however minor it may be. Going back to Coda, it's easy to point at this diagram and say that this feedback part is what led to his frustrations. Again, his messages in the tower pretty much tell us this up front. However, I'd say that the real problem causing all of this has its roots much earlier than that. In general, a creator makes what they make with a specific audience in mind, and if that intended audience happens to be the creator theirself, hey, more power to them. But this doesn't stop the unintended audience from existing, and it doesn't stop those members of the audience from having and sharing their opinions. It's this misunderstanding of an unintended audience that truly gets the snowball rolling and creates the unwanted feedback Coda tries so hard to ignore but can't. Coda's anger with Davey comes from Davey's feedback crossing a line Coda isn't comfortable with. By editing his work, Davey blurs the boundary between audience member and creator in a way that makes Coda downright uncomfortable. Coda views his games as a personal safe space. More likely than not, these games are probably being used to vent personal frustrations in one way or another, and while Davey went overboard with reading into his games, I think it'd be an oversimplification to say that Davey was completely wrong and that Coda's creations don't have any traces of their creator in them at all. Even operating under the assumption that Coda is being honest when he says he isn't depressed, there are more than enough signs in both his games and Davey's stories that could lead one to believe that Coda suffers from social anxiety. Remember when I said this video was going to get personal? Yeah, well, don't say I didn't warn you. The first thing that struck a chord with me when playing this game was the idea of Coda making what he likes to make as a way to handle stress in a positive way, specifically social anxiety. Because, to be completely honest, that's one of my main motivations for making stupid YouTube videos like the one you're watching right now. I find it a beautiful coincidence that this game is called The Beginner's Guide, as the first creation of mine that provided me with any sort of notable following was a 4-part video series I made called the Shin Megami Tensei Beginner's Guide. If you haven't seen those before, keep it that way. Looking back, these videos are pretty shit and frankly kind of embarrassing. But hey, I like to think I've gotten better since then, and I'd be lying if I said that those videos weren't an important step in defining who I am today, not only as an asshole who makes stupid videos, but as a person. When you finish making something that you're passionate about, you gain a sense of reward and satisfaction that no other hobby can ever replicate. The act of putting your thoughts, emotions, time, and energy into your work is a challenging one, but the joy you feel at the end of the long road makes it all worth it. I have a lot more problems going on in my life currently than just social anxiety, but I'd rather not get too much into that. What I will say is that at a time in my life when it's really easy for me to be hard on myself, the Beginner's Guide made me learn to appreciate something about my creative process. Unlike Coda and many others, I'm pretty good at filtering out the feedback I receive and not stressing myself out too much over what the unintended audience members think of my work. And to a lot of you, that might not seem like that big of a deal, but that can be harder than it sounds for people with social anxiety. When you put your creations out there for others to look at, you're showing a part of who you are as a person to your audience. You risk being misunderstood, being judged, and being rejected. It's easy for an outsider to look at the situation between Coda and Davey and say that it all would have been resolved if Coda had just stood up for himself and offered clarification for the games he made. But even doing that is putting another piece of himself out there, another doorway into his person that could be misunderstood or judged. After all, the more someone knows about you, the more significantly they can hurt you. More often than not, creation involves putting yourself out there, and I'm happy with myself that I can accept that for what it is. But for some of us, letting people take a step into our thoughts can be fucking terrifying.
I don't think I ever told you this, but when I took your work and I was showing it to people, it actually felt... it felt as though I were responsible for something important and valuable. And the people who played them, they treated me like I was important. They really listened and cared about what I had to say. Even though I was showing your work, I felt good about myself. Finally, for a moment, while I had that, I liked myself.
Now that we've talked about Coda and his role as a creator, let's talk about Davey as both an audience member and as someone who aspires to be a creator. With how the narrative is framed, Davey's issues don't appear as obvious as Coda's until the very end, and unlike Coda, I think Davey's problem is more multifaceted. At his core, Davey worries about being a good person. He seeks the approval of others and wants to constantly have those around him reinforce the idea that he is both good and well-liked. At first glance, Davey actually seems highly sympathetic. He seems worried about a close friend of his that appears to be going through a dark time. From the way he talks about Coda, it almost sounds like he has more respect for him than even himself. But this is nothing other than a facade, and it shatters as his narration goes on. The harsh truth is that Davey helping Coda appears to be fueled more by a selfish desire to be viewed positively by others rather than a sincere concern for his friend. If Davey really loved Coda's games for what they were, he wouldn't be adding lampposts to them. And if Davey really respected Coda as a person, he wouldn't continually betray him by showing off his games to strangers. Interpretations are a complex matter. The importance of concepts like authorial intent and audience's perception of a work vary from person to person. A large part of the discussion surrounding the Beginner's Guide has been about what this game has to say about death of the author. There's a general agreement that both Davey's constant misinterpretation and Coda failing to provide his own interpretation as the creator is what led to the falling out between them. But aside from that, people have numerous thoughts on what this game is actually trying to say. Personally, I think it's no coincidence that this story about misinterpretation gone horribly wrong is presented in a way that begs us to do the exact same thing. Just by talking about the game at the level we are now, we're dancing a fine line between finding a higher meaning to the game we just experienced and falling down the same hole that Davey did. Personally, what I ended up taking out of the story is that an interpretation of a work that differs from the creators is completely fine to have, but going so far as to force that personal interpretation onto the original work is a line that should never be crossed. You don't own it, you didn't make it, and unless the creator is fine with it, you shouldn't be editing it either. The discussion regarding how much of a work belongs to the creator versus the audience is one that's gone on for years in literary circles. In the context of games, this pops up with things like mods, ROM hacks, and fan games. Now, the gaming community at large has widely accepted these alterations to source material, but that's because the vast majority of them acknowledge that they're not completely original products. Most creators of these things have enough respect towards the original creators that they do not try to force their own alterations onto the parent work and then have the audacity to claim it to be the original. That's the reason even a simple action like adding a lamppost and saying that it's always been there is enough of an offense for many players to completely despise Davey by the end of the game. And motivating Davey the whole way was the dangerous temptation of positive feedback and acceptance. If you've spent any decent amount of time on the internet, you probably have first-hand experience with that primal urge to have others validate our opinions. It doesn't even have to be over something big or important like a political or social issue. Even the tiniest suggestion of disagreement can make a social situation become uncomfortable for many. No matter how hard Bukake Tsunami 420 says people who don't agree with his random internet post are stupid or not worth paying attention to, he still probably cares enough about that post to reply to those who disagree and argue for a solid 3 days about it. If you don't believe me, click on the comments section of any random section of the internet that is even moderately popular. Because even if Bukake Tsunami 420 acts like his opinion is the only one that matters, he probably feels a hell of a lot better about that opinion when it lines up with those around him. We all want to feel like we've contributed to others' lives, and we all want to feel accepted. It's just human nature. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that it's pretty easy for someone to fall into the trap of saying or doing something that they know will be publicly approved of, not because they're actually invested in what they're saying or doing, but just because they want to be accepted. Recently, I took about 20 hours out of my October to volunteer at a domestic abuse shelter. My therapist thought it'd be a positive experience due to my close experience with the issue, and the fact that I find happiness in assisting others. This worked fine for the first 10 hours or so, but around the second half of that time my thoughts shifted from I'm doing a good thing to am I actually doing this because I want to help these poor women or because I want to feel like a good person? And this shift ended up undermining the therapeutic effect of my experience. Now, this incident ended with my therapist squirting me with a water bottle and hitting my head with a rolled up newspaper and us having a nice long conversation about overthinking things, but I do think it's a good idea to take a step back and question your own motivations from time to time. Try not to stress out about it, but just take some time to understand why the actions that make you feel good make you feel that way. Whether or not you're happy or unhappy with what you find, you'll probably turn out a better person for doing so.
Aha. So, this, combined with the entering game from earlier, tells us that Coda believes his games are connected somehow. It could even be that the stairs game and the puzzle game are literally connected in between this and the entering game. There's a bigger picture that all of his games are meant to play a role in, some larger meaning that we won't be able to grasp until we've seen all of them. And once we have, we can step back and start to understand what exactly that bigger picture is.
This part is less about the content of the game and more about the game itself. In the past couple of years, interactive story experiences have become a popular way for small developers with little resources to create and ship their narrative-oriented games. Games like Read and Zone, Stanley Parable, Dear Esther, and Gone Home all found critical praise and a dedicated following after their release. But, like anything on the internet that finds popularity, a vocal backlash was quick to follow. The term walking simulator has become widespread and is often used to describe these games in a negative way. Those who emphasize gameplay mechanics and player agency over story and atmosphere tore into these games as non-interactive, bare-bones experiences that relied too heavily on emotional reaction instead of providing fun obstacles for players to overcome. Many argue that since these games contain a minimum amount of interactivity, that they shouldn't be considered games at all. Sure enough, the beginner's guide has been thrown into this conversation, and its status as a game has been challenged by plenty of people. And while this not a game debate thing is a big part of what I want to talk about in this section, I want to use that conversation as a stepping stone for getting into a more abstract discussion. Nerds are dangerously obsessed with creating categories. I think this is something I really took to heart after entering the Megami Tensei fandom and witnessing the recurring argument on whether or not Persona should be considered a Shin Megami Tensei game. But for our purposes, that's not really a great example to use. I think questions like, is this a game or not, are games art, and even genre classifications are all great examples of ambiguous categorizations leading to heated internet debates that never end. I do want to point out that when someone makes a statement like, this game isn't a game, they generally mean one of two things. The first is that they have a genuine investment in the labeling and mislabeling of various media and believes that the game in question can be better described under different criteria. The second is a quick and easy dismissal used by people who dislike the game and can't be bothered to articulate why. The latter is done by assholes, and while the former is completely valid, I think the internet tends to blow this sort of thing way out of proportion and get more bent out of shape about it than anyone probably should. If you've ever participated in or even witnessed one of these category arguments, you've probably seen that it doesn't take long for them to go nowhere. For example, people say things like, a game is something you can win or lose. But then what about Animal Crossing? You don't ever win or lose in Animal Crossing. You just kind of fuck around until you get bored and then come back years later to find that everyone you know and love has moved away and there are weeds everywhere. Just like real life. But people still call that a game. And then people say something dumb like, a game is only a game if it's fun. Now, I've been playing a lot of Final Fantasy II lately, and if that's what we're basing the definition of a game off of, then that sure as hell isn't a game at all. Classifying something by how fun it is obviously doesn't work. Same with genres. When I was growing up, this is what I thought of when I heard the term roguelike. But nowadays, people think of things like FTL or Binding of Isaac. What about Dark Souls? It's a Japanese action RPG that took elements from both Western and Japanese role-playing games, and it kinda ended up being its own thing. What the fuck is Katamari Damacy? The problem with all these categories is that no matter how you define them, there will always be enough games that shake the boundaries just enough that the whole foundation becomes unstable. Sure, games started out as simple multiplayer competitions and personal tests of skill, but as they started to advance in gameplay mechanics and introduce stories, they branched out in a way that we could have never imagined. Now, I'm not saying that categories aren't important. Putting labels on something helps create a general understanding of what that thing exactly is. But what I am saying is that these labels can be quite arbitrary and not worth stressing yourself out over. I once was talking with a professor of mine about my interest in technology and how I hope to find a fun job within that field. My professor came from a literary background, and like many people in her field, she had a way of looking at random elements of life and making thoughtful comments on them. She told me that since the days of early civilization, humans have longed for a world where the limitations of the physical body are irrelevant and people are able to live solely through thoughts and emotions. In a way, the internet is the closest we've ever gotten to making this dream a reality. But she argued that we'll never truly be able to abandon these restrictions because they're already too ingrained in how we think. It's human nature to identify patterns or separate things into groups even when they don't actually exist. Sometimes, it's better to just acknowledge that some boundaries only exist within your own mind. Overall, the beginner's guide ended up being one of the most bizarrely personal experiences I've had with a game in a while. Similar to how Persona 3 reminded me of why I love character-driven JRPGs and Saints Row 2 reminded me that sometimes games can just be dumb fun, the beginner's guide reminded me why I like to share my opinions on games and make stupid videos like the one you're watching right now. We've had a lot of games that critically deconstruct gameplay mechanics and interactive storytelling, but the beginner's guide is one of the few games I can think of that zooms out its scope enough to look at games as a whole. It's a game about making games and what those games can mean to people. Something I love that good stories do is leave me with something to think about, and holy shit did I have a lot to think about with this one. Out of all the games I played and loved this year, it was quite pleasant to have a smaller game like the beginner's guide catch me off guard.